Chapter 4: The Big Studios. In 1927, the big Hollywood movie was The Jazz Singer, with actor Al Jolson. Across the United States, film directors talked about it, newspapers wrote about it, and everybody wanted to see it. But what was important about this new film? When people went to see The Jazz Singer, they could hear the actors' voices. It was one of the first talkies, and it changed the movie world. Directors did not suddenly stop making silent films. But by 1929, most Hollywood studios made talkies. For silent movie actors, the change was not easy. Some had bad voices, and others could not remember their words. A number of silent stars lost all their work and never made a film again. Later, the wonderful 2011 French film, The Artist, looked back at this time in Hollywood. By the late 1920s, there were 20 film studios in Hollywood. The most important were called the Big Five. They were 20th Century Fox, MGM, RKO, Warner Brothers, and Paramount Pictures. They owned buildings in Hollywood, but they began to build studios in the valleys near here too. These studios were very important at this time. They made about 90% of the feature films in the United States, and they owned nearly all the movie theaters too. When Paramount opened a new movie theater, for example, that theater could only show Paramount films. The studios often showed films for the first time at Hollywood movie theaters. These first nights, or premieres, were sometimes at the famous Grauman's Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard. Like many movie theaters, it was beautiful and very big. 2,258 people could watch movies there. The studios had long contracts with their stars, and actors often stayed with their studio for years. MGM had the actors Clark Gable, Jean Harlow, and Greta Garbo. When people saw them in a film, they understood at once. It was an MGM movie. Thousands of people worked for the studios. Writers, directors, drivers, builders, and of course, actors. There were famous stars and also extras. Actors with very small parts. The director, Cecil B. DeMille, was famous for his epics. Long, expensive films with lots of music and hundreds of extras, like his film Cleopatra in 1934. People from across the world came to Hollywood. They all wanted one thing: to become a film star. They worked in old hotels or cheap shops and then looked for work in the movies. Many went to a company called Central Casting on Hollywood Boulevard. Central Casting found extras for all the big films. In the late 1920s, the names of 17,000 people were on its books. The world of Hollywood was not easy. Only a small number of directors and stars made a lot of money. In the early 1930s, there was the Great Depression in the United States. Companies closed and people were without work. At first, things were not bad in Hollywood, but by 1933, shops and hotels closed here too. But movie theaters were popular in the Great Depression. When audiences watched a movie, they could forget everything for an hour or two. There were different types of films. Every type had its usual story, and audiences understood these. One type of movie was the horror film. People loved to feel afraid when they saw these. In 1931, the first big, talky horror film came out. It was Dracula, with the Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi. His dark eyes, white face, and slow, cold voice became famous. And soon, he was the star of many Hollywood horror films, like Son of Frankenstein. In the 1930s, Hollywood made musicals, films with music and singing too. Two famous actors in musicals were Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. But they did not only sing, they danced beautifully too. Their 1935 film, Top Hat, has one of the most famous dances in the story of Hollywood. Not all Hollywood films had actors in them. A young man called Walt Disney moved to Hollywood in 1923 and opened a cartoon studio. He made small, black and white cartoons here with his brother. In 1934, they began a new type of cartoon, a color feature film called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. They finished the film 3 years later, in 1937. When it came out, the audiences loved everything about it: the music, the story, and the beautiful colors. 2 big color movies opened in 1939. One was the MGM film, The Wizard of Oz. The story came from a popular book by L. Frank Baum. and it was made into a musical with actress Judy Garland. Her character, Dorothy, wore famous red shoes in the film. The actors in this movie all had exciting costumes and makeup. Many of them needed to arrive at the MGM studios at 5 o'clock every morning and stay for hours in the costume and makeup area. The second film came from a book too, Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. The movie was about the war in the United States in the 19th century, 1861 to 1865, and it was a true epic. It had 50 actors with speaking parts, 2,400 extras, 1,100 horses, and it was 3 hours and 58 minutes long. Millions of people saw Vivian Leigh and Clark Gable in this exciting love story. At the time, Gone with the Wind was the longest feature film, and it made more money than any other film, too. 1939 was the best year for films from Hollywood studios, people say. But in the 1940s, the part played by the studios changed. Chapter 5: Changes at the Studios. The Second World War from 1939 to 1945 was important in the story of Hollywood. In the years before the war, many European people from Jewish families arrived here because of problems in their countries. Two of these were the directors Fritz Lang and Billy Wilder. Between 1939 and 1945, Hollywood made lots of war movies. People can easily forget most of these, but everybody remembers one black and white film. This is Casablanca from 1942 with Humphrey Bogart and the Swedish actress Ingrid Bergman. It is a love story in the dark world of war. Not all movies were about war. One 1941 film, Citizen Kane, was about Charles Foster Kane, a rich newspaper owner. Many people call it the best Hollywood film of all time. The writer, director, and most important actor was Orson Welles. He was only 25 years old. Hollywood moved away from the happy films of the 1930s. The new movies were often detective stories with bad, cold characters. They were made in black and white, with the actors' faces sometimes half in the dark. People later called this type of movie film noir. One film noir was the 1946 movie Notorious with Ingrid Bergman and Cary Grant. This exciting film, or thriller, had a British director, Alfred Hitchcock. He made many Hollywood thrillers, and he was famous for his very small part in every film. In 1948, the U.S. government made a big change in the film industry. Studios could not own movie theaters and show only their films in them. From this time, the studios stopped making lots of films every year, and they stopped their long contracts with the big stars, too. This was the end of the wonderful days for the Hollywood studios. The studios had a different problem, too. This time, it was not the government. It was a new thing in people's houses: the television. In 1950, about 6 million U.S. homes had a TV, and by 1960, 60 million homes had one. Now, some people stop going to the movies every week. Many old Hollywood film studios began to make TV shows. Some studios made bigger, more exciting films too, all in wonderful color. And epics were popular again. In 1959, there was the $15 million movie Ben-Hur, about Rome long ago. It was by the director William Wyler. This movie, with actor Charlton Heston, was made over 7 years with 8,000 extras and 100,000 costumes. In the 1950s, people wanted to forget the dark war years. They were interested in happy films again, like Disney's 1950 cartoon, Cinderella, or the 1952 musical, Singing in the Rain, with actor Gene Kelly. In 1959, audiences laughed for hours at Some Like It Hot, by director Billy Wilder. The film had the actors Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon, and a beautiful 32-year-old actress, Marilyn Monroe. She became one of the most famous faces of Hollywood, but died in 1962 when she was only 36. Other Hollywood stars died young, too. One actor, James Dean, was called the first American teenager. He was in only 3 films. Most importantly, the 1955 movie Rebel Without a Cause. But he died suddenly in a car accident before the film came out. He was 24 years old. Music for teenagers became a new industry. Music companies opened in Hollywood, and studios soon made movies with singers like Elvis Presley. Excited teenagers stood and danced in movie theaters when they saw his films, like Jailhouse Rock in 1957. But the 1960s was a bad time for the Hollywood film industry. The expensive 1963 epic Cleopatra, with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, lost a lot of money. And that year was the worst for the U.S. film industry. Only 121 films were made. Many old Hollywood studios had money problems, and they sold their buildings, land, and wonderful costumes too. In 1970, MGM sold 2 of Dorothy's beautiful red shoes from The Wizard of Oz for $15,000. By the 1970s, Hollywood was a different place from the 1940s. A big road now went through the area, and the Whitley Heights village was in 2 halves. Many old buildings were no longer there. In 1956, builders took down the Hollywood Hotel, once home to Rudolph Valentino. When visitors came to Hollywood in the 1970s, many did not like the area. They found dirty streets, bad hotels, and cheap shops. Most film stars now lived in other parts of Los Angeles, like Beverly Hills. The old world of Hollywood was dead. Chapter 6: New Hollywood. By 1970, there was only one big film studio in Hollywood. That was Paramount Pictures. All the others were in places in the Los Angeles area, like Burbank. In the 1970s, new directors came to Hollywood, like Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, and George Lucas. They went to film school, and they were interested in Italian and French movies from the 1960s. One young director, Steven Spielberg, made a thriller called Jaws, about a shark in the sea near a small American town. This 1975 film was very expensive, at $9 million. It came out at a popular time of year, the summer, and it opened in about 450 movie theaters at once. Jaws was a new type of film, a blockbuster. These films need a lot of money, but they make a lot of money too, and are very popular. One 1977 blockbuster changed the film world. This was the science fiction movie Star Wars by George Lucas. It became famous for its characters and special effects. Many of these special effects were made with computers, and people called these moving pictures computer-generated imagery, or CGI. After audiences saw Star Wars, they could go to the shops and buy Star Wars things too. It was one of the first films with merchandising. There were Star Wars pens, watches, clocks, bags, and many other things. In 1972, the Philips Company began to sell home video recorders for about $2,000, and families could watch Hollywood movies at home. Home videos made lots of money for the movie industry. When Steven Spielberg's 1982 blockbuster, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, went to video, it made more than $75 million in the United States. One type of movie had merchandising and was very popular on video. This was the superhero film, like the blockbusters Superman in 1978 and Superman 2 in 1980. Later, in 1989, there was the first of a number of big Batman films, and in the 2000s, the X-Men movies. In the 1990s, there were big changes in the movie world. Firstly, many movie theaters had a number of rooms now, and they could show more than one film at once. This was called a multiplex. The world's biggest multiplex opened in Madrid, Spain, in 1998. It could show 25 different films at once to 9,200 people. New digital technology was important for filmmakers. Directors could now put Hollywood actors into old films. The 1994 film Forrest Gump showed Tom Hanks with famous people from earlier times, like John F. Kennedy. Other movies, like the 1996 science fiction film Independence Day, were made truly exciting with CGI pictures, too. The biggest 1990s movie was Titanic. This 1997 blockbuster by director James Cameron, with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, told the story of the last days of the ship, the Titanic. It was then Hollywood's most expensive film of all time, at about $200 million. And it made the most money, too. $1.8 billion across the world. Digital technology came into the home, too, in the late 1990s. People stopped using videos, and they bought DVD players. DVDs had a better picture and often showed more things from the film. Cartoons changed with the new technology, and studios began to make cartoons with computers in the late 1990s and 2000s. There were the 4 Shrek films, all with the exciting Shrek characters, the Toy Story films, and Finding Nemo. When a movie was popular, like Shrek, the studios often made a film series, a number of different films about the characters. Other film series at this time were Pirates of the Caribbean, Harry Potter, and the Twilight Saga. In the early years of the 21st century, film companies made more movies in 3D. Of course, 3D technology was not new. Audiences watched 3D films in the 1950s. But the 3D glasses were not very good, and people could not see the 3D pictures well. In 2009, everybody wanted to see one film in 3D: James Cameron's science fiction movie, Avatar. After only 3 weeks, it made more money than his earlier blockbuster, Titanic. 3D films are not always popular with audiences, but some movie companies like them very much. Are there going to be a lot of 3D films in the future? We can only wait and see.